All right, let's start. My name is Eric Toshalis. I'm Senior Research Director at Jobs for the Future, where my primary responsibility is to direct the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative. I'm delighted today to welcome you all to another one of our research webinars that we sponsor. We support multiple research projects. We finished our first cycle of 4 different research teams' work over 2 years just this last summer. And so this is one of the culminating deliverables for the project from EDC's team. We are delighted today to have presenting Dr. Karen Shakman from EDC's team. She was the lead PI on this project. She'll tell you much more about the details and is going to go through a presentation just momentarily. What I want to do is briefly describe a little bit about how this hour will go and what opportunities you'll have to engage the presenter and myself in making meaning of this and its application and implications for policy, practice, and communities both in the New England region and around the country. And then I'll pass it off to Karen to begin. So the way that we'll run this today is we'll start really quickly with a polling feature here in a moment. Then we'll dive right into the actual presentation of the findings. And then for the last, say, 12, 15, 17 minutes or so of the presentation, we'll open it up for questions. The way that typically works best is that we'll ask you to be thinking about questions that you might have as you go along, and then toward the end, there'll be an opportunity for you to enter those questions in the chat function. You operate the chat function by clicking on, if you scroll to the bottom of the screen there's a little sort of thought bubble. Press that button, it'll open up the chat function on the side, and make sure you send it to everyone so that we can all see those questions. And then staff will be curating those questions at the end in order to tee those up. One brief other quick moment here before we jump in. The implications for this study are wide-ranging. Really excited about the questions that it raises for the field as we think about robust student-centered learning practices and the research that support those practices, and the way that those practices exist within a legislative and implementation kind of ecosystem, and how that is shifting both at the district level, at the school level, and all the way up into state and federal levels. And I think this study informs a lot of the way that we can think about the implications for what those practices can and should and will do on both teacher practices and also on implications on students. It was a delight to work with the EDC team over the 2-year study. Can't say enough about the level of rigor that they brought to their investigations and also their local responsiveness in thinking through problems of practice at the real classroom level, at the district level, and even thinking about it from a state level. The complex thinking that's required in that process is no joke, and the EDC team rose to the occasion at every turn. So with that, I want to hand it off to Karen and her team, and I look forward to learning with you all today. Thanks for joining us. Karen, you might be on mute there. You're unmuted as far as I can tell from our side, so it might be at your phone or might be at your computer. One sec, everyone. We'll just make sure Karen gets on here and this audio. I'm tempted to whistle the Jeopardy tune, but I'm going to refrain. Not hearing you yet, Karen.
Can you hear me now? Hello.
Yeah, there you go. Perfect.
Yay!
We're in. Thanks.
That's my big opening. So we're still right on time. Sorry about the technical difficulty. I was actually starting off by just thanking Eric and the team at JFF for the opportunity they provided to us over the last few years. It was a real privilege to be a part of the first collaborative and to have the opportunity to engage with the folks at JFF as well as the really wonderful people they found from across the country as other collaborators. So I'm sad that that time is over, but I know there are great things ahead for that whole group. So thank you so much. And thank you for having me here today. And I'm glad you can hear me. So I'm excited today to talk a little bit about the work that we did in Maine over the last 2 years. I am one person on today, but I am not alone. I worked with several colleagues at EDC, and I would be remiss in not mentioning them. Brandon Foster, Noman Kanani, Jill Marcus, and Josh Cox, all of whom were instrumental in our study. So without further ado, as those of you who are looking at the screen know, this study took place in Maine. And so my first question, our first poll, is to ask all of you if you are familiar with the Maine proficiency-based education requirement or context. And if you would click yes or no, that'll give us a sense of who's out there. And I'll just pause here while people see the poll. And I'll just let you know that this is the first of several. So get ready and answer the poll, this first poll, and then we'll move on. And there will be other polls as we go forward. This is a little way for us to know a bit about who's in the room or in the virtual room. So appreciate you taking a moment to do that. And Melanie, I think I don't know how we're doing on people responding to the poll, but maybe we can pull up the results now and we'll go forward from there.
All right, last call and we're closing.
All right. Well, as we see the results, let me just pause and say a little bit about the Maine context, which I think is actually very interesting. And I'll say that when we started the study in 2016, it was interesting, and it just got more interesting as time unfolded. So if you're not familiar with the Maine context, and I see it's about half and half of the group, in 2012, Maine passed a proficiency-based diploma law that required that students could only earn a high school diploma after showing they'd mastered specific skills. So instead of taking courses and earning credits like the old standard, Maine shifted to a proficiency-based model whereby students had to demonstrate proficiency in all the content areas like English, math, science, et cetera. And this law was put forward in 2012, but didn't take place immediately. Schools were given several years to kind of get it off the ground. And so over the years from 2012 through 2013-14, the school boards, teachers, and district administrators spent this time gearing up for the proficiency-based graduation standards kind of going live and being kind of high stakes. But the shift to this quite different system was controversial, to say the least. And in July 2018, after several instances of the state sort of kicking the can down the road a little bit in terms of when it would become actually in effect for the graduating class, in July of 2018, just as our report was going to JFF, the governor of Maine, Governor LePage, signed into law an act that actually allowed schools to award either a proficiency-based or a credit-based diploma, essentially taking all the teeth out of the original requirement. So it rolls back all of the requirements that were enacted originally in 2012 and that schools had spent several years preparing to meet. And it removes this mandate that students graduate with a proficiency-based diploma. That is not to say that all the schools in the state have thrown the baby out with the bathwater. They're not doing anything. Many of the schools have made a lot of progress and are intending to continue going forward with this, but it's not state law anymore. And our study was conducted in the years when implementation was really full steam ahead, because it was up until July of 2018 expected that students who were freshmen in the 2017-18 school year would be the first class of students for whom the diploma would be expected to be proficiency-based. So when we were in there studying, it was essentially the year just before that class arrived and the first year of that freshman class's year in the school. And the whole time we were conducting the study, the expectation is that this would proceed. So that's just a little bit of context, and we can move to the next slide. So what I'm going to do today is just provide an overview of the study, share some findings, not all of them, but just some key ones that I think will be fruitful for discussion. We'll have a pause for some discussion kind of mid-course, and then I'll share a few more findings, and then we'll end with some additional Q&A and discussion. So that's my plan for the next several minutes. So moving to the next slide, this is just kind of the who, what, when, where. Melanie, if you would just click to the next slide. So the who, where, when, and what of the study. So as I'd already said, the study took place in Maine. We worked with 11 secondary schools, and we had a sample of approximately 2,400 students in grades 9 to 12 that were in the study. And we were interested in a few different things. So one, we wanted to know about students' exposure to different aspects of student-centered proficiency-based learning. And then we wanted to know the characteristics of those students that might predict their exposure, as well as the characteristics that might predict the characteristics that predict the amount of exposure. And then we were interested in the relationship between students' exposure to these different practices and outcomes. And those outcomes were engagement and academic outcomes. And finally, we kind of wanted to know what was the context, what was going on in these schools during these 2 years, what was implementation looking like. So that was what we were studying over the 2 years. And to do that, we administered a survey, which I'm about to talk about. We also did qualitative data collection. So we can go to the next slide. So the first question, what patterns of exposure to proficiency-based education exist, and what are the characteristics of these profiles, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Again, we were interested in what were students reporting their experiences were in school related to proficiency-based student-centered learning. And then we wanted to know whether or not groups of students were experiencing proficiency-based student-centered learning in similar ways to one another, and if they clustered into specific groups, which will all become clear momentarily. But before I get there, we're going to pause for another poll, and we'll ask you if you think that students within the same school might have different amounts of exposure to these types of practices, or do you think if they're in the school, their experiences would be the same? So do you think students within the same school might have different amounts of exposure to proficiency-based student-centered practices? And we'll let you think about that for a minute and answer that poll, and then we'll move on.
Okay, we're closing the poll.
Okay. So how did we do? What do you think? We're just going to wait and see what the result is. So the answer from many of you, about 70%, I guess there's some folks who say, I am not going to commit to an answer, but the rest of you say yes. You think that students might have different amounts of exposure. We must have some researchers in the room if we have 30% of people saying no answer. So that's great. All right, so, well, in fact, we found, yes, that students did have different experiences even within the same school. So we can go on to the next slide. All right, so how did we get at that? So we have a survey that we implemented, and you'll see that the survey link is available on this slide. This was a survey that was originally developed under our EDC holds the REL, the Regional Educational Lab Northeastern Islands contract, and we originally developed a survey on competency-based learning a few years ago, and we implemented that same survey for this study. It's a publicly available survey. Anyone can use it, so I encourage you, if you're in the business of looking for good surveys, then I would encourage you to access the survey and have a look at it. But we use this survey with students, and it's a survey of students where they report on their experiences and their exposure to different aspects of student-centered learning. It's important for me to say they're reporting sort of the gestalt, their overall experience in school. They're not reporting on an individual classroom's experience. So we're asking students to think across their classes and across their years and report on what their experience is in school. And there are 5 domains for this survey. The survey itself is much larger, but for the purposes of the analyses we conducted for this study, we zeroed in on, 16 items that are really indicative, really capture each of these domains that we were interested in looking at. So I'm just going to talk through what each of those domains are and the items that we focused on for our analysis. So the first is progression through demonstration of mastery, and you'll see 3 items here. And they address the extent to which students were expected to move on when they had demonstrated mastery, their ability to move on when they were ready, even if their peers in class were not ready, and their exposure to the use of rubrics to measure their practice. their progress. So that was the first domain we looked at. And I'll come back and talk about a few of these domains, comparing our qualitative analyses to the results from the survey. But the second domain, anytime, anywhere learning, refers to students' opportunity to complete some or all of their course requirements online, their ability to earn credit for out-of-school experiences, and their access to internships and job shadowing. Then we have personalization. We have 3 items there, and those include items that reference the nature of classroom instruction, such as the amount of whole class lecture, and I'll just flag for you that will come back as an interesting thing for us to talk about. The extent to which teachers engage with students in small groups or individually, and teachers introducing or teaching material in different ways for different students. Then we have flexible assessment, which contained items that measure whether students could choose how they demonstrate their learning, whether they had opportunities to retake assessments, and whether students could demonstrate mastery in multiple ways. And finally, we have ownership and agency. We have 4 items that we highlighted there. This is kind of the 21st century skills and dispositions category. And you'll see the items here generally have to do with students' perseverance, responsibility, and timeliness, as well as a final item that asks students whether or not they feel that they knew the steps to take during high school in order to be prepared for what they will do after they graduate. So those were the 16 items that we employed for the analyses that I'm about to talk about. But before I do that, I want to say one thing, and then we're going to have a poll. So I wanted to just comment that, some of these practices were more specifically aligned to the state's proficiency-based graduation requirement than others. Some of the kinds of practices here may be experiences or practices that teachers are implementing just in the course of their regular work and have for many years, and some of the practices were more steeped in the work that the schools were doing to move towards the proficiency-based graduation requirements. So I just wanted to make note of that. And with that, Melanie, we have another poll, and this one asks you, when you think about these 5 domains, to ask you what you think students had most exposure to. Of these 5 domains, and thinking about the state of Maine and implementation of the proficiency-based graduation requirement, which of these 5 domains do you think was the students had the most experience with? And I'll pause there and let you think about that and answer.
Okay, last call for poll responses.
I hope you all are enjoying these polls. I like them. You're all out there in cyberspace, so it's nice to know what you're thinking. All right, what do we think? Okay, interesting. So we've got flexible assessment is, we've got a lot of no answers again, but that's okay. We've got flexible assessment at 29%. We'll come back to that. I'll be talking about that. I see progression through demonstration of mastery at 17%, closely followed by personalization, with anytime, anywhere, and ownership the lowest. And actually, that's so interesting that people pick that, because the 3 domains I'm going to zero in on and talk about today are the mastery, the personalization, and the flexible assessment. I'm not going to talk really about anytime, anywhere, and ownership, except to just show you what the overall responses were. But you would be right, those of you who picked anytime, anywhere as those of you who did not pick anytime, anywhere, really that is an area where we did not see as much movement as some of the other areas. So before we move to the next slide, thank you for that. And I just want to say, before I put a table up on the screen that you have to kind of dig into, that what we were interested in looking at was if groups of students were experiencing these different aspects of proficiency-based student-centered learning in similar ways. So did the students cluster in terms of their responses? Were there a group of students that reported, for example, high exposure to progression through demonstration of mastery and low exposure to anytime, anywhere, and a different group of students who had the opposite of that? We were looking to see, were there sort of cohorts of students in terms of the experiences they were having in school. And to do this, we employed what we call latent profile analysis, which allows us to look at kind of the groups of students that emerge out of the results of the survey, rather than, say, looking at a subgroup of students like free and reduced price lunch eligible students and saying, well, how did they respond? We do get to that, but we wanted to let the groups kind of come out of the results of the survey. So with that, we'll flip to the next slide, and I'll walk you through this. So it's a little hard to see, but you'll see the 5 domains are represented here. We've got anytime, anywhere on the left, moving up to mastery-based progression on the right. And you'll see 3 different colored lines in the figure. And these 3 lines represent the groups of students who were experiencing these different aspects of proficiency-based education similarly. And we'll call these groups of students profiles, or PBE profiles, going forward. That's the language that we use in the report. You'll also see that each of the lines has dots associated with them, and if you look down, these dots correlate with the item from the survey. So it's easy for you, if you're interested, to go back, and you can look at this in the paper. You can see the actual item, what was actually asked in the item, and then how students fell along this, along their profile, what their response, their average response was. The height of each dot along the axis, the y-axis, indicates the level of exposure to that PBE practice. So a dot higher up the y-axis indicates that members of the profile reported that they had more experience with that actual practice. So, for example, if you look at teach diff, which is, do teachers teach content in different ways? The yellow group at the top had more exposure to that, reported more exposure than the red or the blue group, and that's how you can look at it going forward. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we learned now that you kind of are oriented to what you're looking at. So first, we learned there were 3 profiles. So students really did cluster into 3 distinct groups. They weren't all, we'd asked you the poll question earlier whether or not you thought all students had the same experience, even if they were even if they were in the same school, could they have different experiences? And many of you said yes, and you were right. This plot is for all students across all schools. And when we plotted it by school, we saw a similar distinct 3 profiles. So that's to say that that there were students having different experiences in each school and across all the schools. And you'll notice that for the most part, the 3 profiles are quite distinctly separate from one another. The items really, there is space between them with the exception of give lecture, and I will come back to that. But for the most part, what we're seeing is that there were distinctly different responses for these 3 profiles. I already talked about how these profiles existed in all schools, so that's an important observation. We wondered if would there be a high-flying school, and that's accounting for all the students in, say, the yellow line, and that is not the case. We've also labeled these profiles carefully. You could say high, medium, and low, but that would really be a misnomer when you look at where the yellow is on the plot. It's right about in the middle of the plot, and that's to say that there was no profile or no group of students that were clustering up around the 0.75 or the 1. So there's still a lot of room for growth there in the plot. And so we named these profiles as minimal PBE, so very little exposure, low medium PBE, really in terms of where it sits kind of below the mid-range and sort of hovering near the mid-range. And then the last one is medium, because again, it's really kind of hovering in the middle of the plot with some above the mid-range. So that's just to say, when you look at this, don't think about these as high, medium, and low. Really think about them as medium and then lower from there. You'll also see that I said that, okay. And then you'll notice that these 3 groups follow the same general trend. This is the last thing I wanted to say. So I had said in the last slide, we were interested to see if maybe there's one group for whom one of these domains is high and something else is low, and another group for which it's flopped. And we did not see that. We really see they're generally following the same trend. Those for whom project cred is lower than, the blue line, the getting credit for projects outside of school is lower than it is for the red line. Similarly, for the blue line, small group work is lower than it is for the red line. So the pattern sort of repeats itself for all 3 profiles. All right, so other patterns are a little trickier, but get more into like what do we make of all this. And the first is that there's lower overall exposure to these more non-traditional approaches like internships, credit for projects outside of school, and choice in how to demonstrate learning. So overall, regardless of profile, those tend to be lower. And then there's higher overall exposure to the opportunity to retake assessments, and that was something that many of you chose flexible assessment as the thing that might be the most actively in place. And you were right insofar as retaking assessments as part of flexible assessment is something we saw more of. In terms of teachers teaching content in different ways, and also in terms of teachers lecturing. So that is something that, interestingly, we could have taken this out of the plot and decided, well, there's no variation, so we don't need to include it, but it makes a very important point in terms of no matter what else is going on, regardless of what else students are reporting, they're still reporting a lot of a lecture. You'll also see that in all three profiles, anytime, anywhere learning is the area where students really reported the lowest overall exposure, while mastery-based progression is on the higher end of exposure. So this may not be surprising when you think about the Maine context where the policy lever was the graduation requirement, the proficiency-based graduation requirement. So that may account for the fact that mastery-based progression students reported more experience with that. I'm going to come back to an interesting observation. Those of you who are looking closely at the plot will see that there are 3 items in mastery-based progression, and there's one that's way lower than the other 2, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But if you'll flip to the next slide, just sort of taking it all together, the results across all 3 profiles do suggest that despite some exposure to different aspects of proficiency-based student-centered learning and students reporting that across their classroom experiences, they're also reporting fairly traditional experiences of school. So that's kind of an important takeaway. But we didn't rely just on the survey data to try to understand student exposure. We also conducted qualitative data collection in a subset of the schools to really understand more deeply what was happening, what was the phase of implementation, and a reminder that these are schools who were not, they were implementing this state-level policy. They did not have huge grants. They did not have necessarily new leadership implementing this new initiative. So these are regular schools implementing this state-level requirement in the context of sort of all the other work they're doing, and in the context of having been a school with faculty who, some cases, have been there for many, many years. We interviewed one guy who had been a student in the same classroom where he was now teaching and was in his 38th year. So you have to remember that context as well. All right, so let's go to the next slide. And we're getting close to discussion, but I want to talk about these 3 domains that I said I was going to talk about, the mastery-based progression, personalization, and flexible assessment. But let me start with mastery-based progression. As illustrated in the chart, and you see that there, and I'm going to read here because I want to make sure I say this exactly right. So mastery-based progression had overall higher exposure, but only for 2 of the 3 items, and you'll see the way it dips in the chart. Most notably, students in all 3 profiles reported having higher exposure to the need to show teachers that they have mastered a standard before they are allowed to move on than exposure to the opportunity to move on when they have demonstrated proficiency on the standard, even if others are not ready. And that's a really interesting result, I think. It may sound a little confusing because these items are very similar in their language, but they're quite distinct. Although students must demonstrate proficiency to move on, and that's what they're reporting, this group of students is saying, yes, we have to demonstrate proficiency to move on. If they do demonstrate proficiency way ahead of their peers, so if their other students in the class are not ready, students are reporting that they cannot move on until the majority of the class has demonstrated proficiency as well. And that sort of bore out in our discussion in our focus groups with students and parents and some of the teachers, the challenge of figuring out how to have some students move on in the context of regular school when many students in class maybe aren't ready for the next thing. So you have to think about the challenges present in a traditional classroom with moving students ahead of their peers. It does require significant structural changes, flexibility in student schedules and classroom structures, which we heard a little bit about from our interviews, that allows students to work on different content within the same class, as well as considerable planning by the teacher to have content ready for students at different levels. And as the quote here illustrates, which I'll just read, it's a real challenge. So the quote is, I think in theory it's a good idea, having kids move on if they're ready or if they've already met that standard, but it's a lot to ask from one teacher. if we're thinking of a teacher in their traditional role where they stand up in front of a class and teach the entire class one lesson. One kid doesn't get it, then you can't really have the other kids move on, or else that kid is going to be left behind. So this is a real tension in the context of, traditional school. And that said, we did have some evidence that some teachers were trying to do this mastery-based progression, but in general, these teachers were relying primarily on students engaging in individualized learning using computer-assisted content or curricula, rather than having students engaging in different curricula in collaboration with their teachers and peers. So I'll mention this again in a bit, but there just appears to be, or maybe there is, a trade-off between engaging in proficiency, mastery-based work and engaging in deep interaction between teachers and students and among students. Perhaps this is just something we have to get over. Maybe it requires a lot of professional development and support for teachers to figure out how to do it, but it's not a nut that has necessarily been cracked. So let's move on to the next one. And we'll talk about flexible assessment now, which many of you selected. And yes, in general, we found that while flexible assessment practices tended to be fairly traditional, where teachers are employing mostly paper and pencil tests or tests on computers, there is one place where the schools are making a lot of movement. So again, there didn't appear to be a lot of project-based learning portfolios or performance-based assessment either that students reported on in the survey or that we heard about from our qualitative work. But students have worked over the last few years in shifting the policy about retaking assessments. And this has been kind of a big shift for schools. And you see the retaking assessment is higher relative to the other items, particularly for the blue and the red group. So schools have focused on getting all students to know and understand the core content, even if that means retaking an assessment as many times as it takes until the student can master that content, which is kind of a big piece of thinking about proficiency-based education. You don't move on until you've mastered the content. Interestingly, this has been met with some frustration, maybe not surprisingly, but it has been met with some frustration from both students and parents who feel that it can create an unfair system whereby some students work hard to learn that content the first time, they study for the test, they take the test, and they achieve proficiency right away. And then there are other students who maybe put off studying, see what's on the test, and then ultimately take it, demonstrate proficiency and arrive at the same place as their peers eventually. This may be a function of the kinds of assessments. To do retaking assessments like this in the context of traditional assessments may create this tension, but if you were doing more diverse and deep assessments, maybe rather than the traditional tests, maybe this would not be such an issue, but it did appear to be an issue in our interviews. That said, there were, of course, additional teachers and parents and students who did talk about how they understood and appreciated the focus on retaking assessments because it ensured that their students were demonstrating mastery of the content and not just getting a grade to move on. I will say, and this is something that comes across in some parts of our report, that community support for something like this appears to be critical. There was a lot of emotion around this issue and around grading in our interviews in the field. And it seems that when the schools are making these big shifts to changing the grading system, changing the assessment system, that considerable work needs to be done to bring the community along with you, whether that community is your teachers or your parents or your students, because it's a big shift, and it's a shift in paradigm that we found hard for the people we interviewed, many of them to particularly parents and students, to get on board with. All right, next one, last one I'm going to talk about, and then we're going to have some Q&A. Personalization. So across all three profiles, students reported frequent exposure to whole class lecture, and this is the only item in the analysis that did not vary by profile. In other words, regardless of whatever variation in exposure the students may have to other practices, so regardless of how much exposure they had to the other practices, they did not have variation. They did not report, or they continued to experience this fairly traditional talk and chalk, teacher-centered practice of lecture. So you'll see the quote here, in math class, probably the same old lecture, do the problem, take a test. So that is still and that's a principal reporting on, what he sees. So that was an interesting observation, let me jump to something else and raise a question. So before I raise the question, there were interesting results related to group work, which is another item in the survey. So for the minimal and low medium groups, so for the blue and the red group, students' exposure appeared to fall somewhere in the middle relative to the other items in terms of exposure to group work. So within their profile, group work was kind of in the middle in terms of what they reported exposure to. That's for the low and the low medium group. However, for the medium exposure group, which is the yellow one, the highest in our plot, that group appeared to have less exposure to group work relative to the other PBE practices. This may suggest that the emphasis on demonstrating proficiency, which was Maine's focus, may drive teachers to focus more on individualized instruction, which in turn may lead them to implement less group. And that's kind of a corollary with the observation earlier about, within mastery-based progression, that the teachers who were doing it tend to be doing it as students engaging in online or doing computer-based work rather than mastery-based progression being in a collaborative environment. So it's just kind of an interesting observation and raises again this question of whether or not there's a perceived or real trade-off between teaching content in different personalized ways and conducting group-based and collaborative work. And I know one of our colleagues who was in the first research collaborative group of studies, studied very deeply collaborative work. I think it's a really interesting area to investigate, and particularly to think about collaboration in the context of a mastery-based progression or proficiency-based, mastery-based proficiency personalized kind of context. How do you bring collaboration and group work into the mix? So I think this is something to take up as a point of discussion and to really think about whether or not this trade-off between personalizing and collaboration is real, and what kinds of support schools or teachers need to implement these practices simultaneously rather than seeing a tension between them. So with that, I'm going to stop. I've been talking a lot. We're going to go to the next slide. And we're going to put a poll up. And it asks you really whether or not these results resonate with your own experience. You know, I don't have the privilege of knowing kind of who's out there and how many of you are working in schools or working with schools, but curious to know what of these results are strike you as yes, that's exactly what we see, and what doesn't. And I have some questions up to get us going, and I think the way we'll do this is we will raise these questions, and people can put questions in the chat related to these three domains and any questions you have about that, or comments. You know, we're interested in why you think we might have found these results, what you think the challenges are associated with implementing these practices, particularly mastery-based or proficiency-based education and personalization in a traditional school environment. And then what do you think a school needs to do to support and bring people on board with, for example, flexible assessment? So these are some questions for all of you. And let me pause there and see, Eric, I don't know if you want to funnel some questions or if you have some comments or observations as we wait for people's juices to get flowing. And I think we have about, I'm looking at the time, I think we have a few minutes for this, and then I'll fly through the rest of the results so that we can have a little more time for discussion.
Yeah, just to build on a point you were making earlier there, Karen, Melanie just posted in the chat function off to the side there the other study by the American Institutes for Research that actually looked into the extent to which personalized education can be enhanced through collaborative, cooperative learning activities. Really, it helps to highlight for us in the field, I think, a finding that may be suggested by your data here, that personalization does not and should not equal isolation, that there are ways to personalize education, there are ways to individualize, to differentiate learning. That doesn't mean the teacher focuses solely on the individual student and caters everything that individual student. There are ways to actually achieve that personalization through rich collaborative opportunities, as long as those collaborative opportunities have built into them sufficient modes to capture differences in status, to protect kids' sense of belonging, to make sure that there's adequate representation and sharing and a voice that's equitable. So there's lots of caveats to go with that. But Karen, you're totally right to point that out as a possible finding or a possible interpretation of the findings here. And I think the other study from our last cycle is a way to bolster that.
I see a couple questions here. I want to clear up one question here. Before, obviously, if this question is here, it may be something others have as well. The question is about what types of variables were used to make the minimal, low, and medium groups. Those are based solely on the results of the survey. So those are not, the students in the minimal group are in the minimal group because they reported less exposure. So by minimal, low, and medium, or minimal, low, medium, and medium, we're really only referring to how they responded to the survey. That's the only element that factored into them being in that group. So I just wanted to clarify that. And then we have a question here about the state providing districts or schools with any guidance on how to implement this policy. That is a tricky one. If you interview the principals and talk to people in the field, I think you'll probably hear not enough. Certainly, it depends on where they are in the state and how much access they have. Districts did a lot of work and some collaborated to work with one another. But no, there wasn't a ton of, I wouldn't say there was a ton of guidance and support in how to do this. I will also say, and this isn't part of my presentation, but it's in the report, where the schools spent a lot of their first few years was on identifying the standards that would make up their proficiencies. So they have their state standards, and they weren't expecting that the students would demonstrate proficiency on all standards in all disciplines. So they had to identify like their power standards or the standards that they would then transfer to the proficiency and then measure proficiency. And then they had to figure out how to measure proficiency and how to rate it and how to change their grading system. There was a lot of work done on that piece of it. Perhaps to the, perhaps as a result, not as much work went into, well, what kinds of professional support are needed to move teachers' practices. So because we were probing, much of what we probed was about what was happening in the classroom, some of that was invisible. Some of the work that was done was invisible to students in terms of the back end piece of the work until they saw the new grading system or they saw we've moved to proficiency. But many of the folks we talked to said they felt like their next step was to work on professional development and implementing new practices in the classroom. And one person that we interviewed, a superintendent, said something to the effect of, if they'd just given us, maybe we could have sort of cut to the chase more quickly. If they'd said, here are the proficiencies we want, we could have spent more time and gotten more quickly into, well, what's the kind of support we need to give teachers to teach in different ways. So maybe a missed opportunity or maybe a lesson for the future.
Just looking at the poll response there, yeah, again, just make sure, folks, that if you're interested in doing the polling function, that you hit the submit button at the end to make sure that it registers. But yeah, it looks like there's a strong yes in the resonance here, maybe one no there. Interesting. Particularly, it might be possible, if possible, Karen, that your discussion questions here, I think, go deeper into do these resonate? And given that, I recognize several of the names of folks on the call, there are people that work in nonprofit organizations that support many of the state and district level leaders to implement these sorts of practices. There are school-based and district-based people that are on this call. So I'm just curious if people could start posting in the chat here, to what do you attribute these results? Why are we seeing some of these practices being implemented more than others here and there in this sort of spotty implementation? Just curious about how people would answer some of the questions that Karen has posed here as we get deeper into the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we did this work in the context of a very specific policy in a very specific place, but I would imagine that some of what we see in terms of what seems more easy to implement and what is harder would be relevant for many contexts. Anytime, anywhere learning, for example, where we're talking about establishing opportunities for students out in the community, that takes a fair amount of work, and Students need access to transportation. I mean, there are all kinds of challenges associated with that, which I think would apply. I don't know if it's more of a rural concern than an urban concern, but I think it's interesting to think about, well, what are the barriers to anytime, anywhere learning, and how do you break those down? I'm very interested in this question of what's the relationship between mastery-based progression and personalization and building 21st century skills like collaboration. So that one is one I'm really interested to hear what people's thoughts are about that. So maybe we'll just
so
pause
while we're
for a
waiting
minute.
for a few here, Karen, I have just a quick side note here that to the extent that we're seeing different implementation and different resistance to some of these implementations. I was in a conversation earlier this week with a state legislator in a state that will go unnamed. It is a state that has promoted itself as being on the front end of competency-based / mastery-based / proficiency-based implementation. And this state legislator, who's a former 30-plus year classroom educator, said that consistently the response that she's getting from parents who are in the schools and districts that are implementing these practices is just go back to the basics. I wasn't taught this way. Just teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. It worked for me. It'll work for my kid. I don't know what this fancy stuff is that you're trying to do with these competencies. And so there's this back to basics rhetoric that even though the research is compelling, even though the students are coming home and reporting positive experiences, the parents don't have enough of an understanding because there hasn't been any publicity campaign to help them understand it. And to that end, I would refer people, this is again, more research and more connections across the field. KnowledgeWorks just yesterday released a one-pager that helps to distinguish for multiple audiences the differences between traditional approaches and more competency-based or proficiency-based approaches. And it's just a real simple but clean and clear thing that would be just as helpful for teachers as it would be for school board, as it would be for parents, to help kind of explain some of the reasons why there's some resistance here that are I think, popping up in the EDC studies data. So with that, there's some questions that are popping up in the stuff, if you want to comment on that, Karen.
Yeah. So let me just say, I think what we observed in Maine is that there are sort of two groups for whom, in the sort of family community, for whom the shift to a proficiency-based model is tricky for them to accept. There are the very high-performing students who have done well in the current system, and those parents sometimes have difficulty embracing a model where the students aren't rewarded in the way they've been rewarded in the past. I shouldn't just say parents, I should say the community, so students and their parents. And also, and legitimately, there were concerns raised. So if my student is valedictorian or in the top 10% of his class, he then has access to scholarships for college. How are we going to deal with that in this new context? So those kinds of questions are raised by that group. And then there's the other issue, which came up a lot in the public comment and in the articles that were written in Maine, which is the special education population, and how are we thinking about meeting proficiency for students who are special education and are not necessarily accessing the curriculum in the same way. And I don't mean, all students with IEPs. I mean students who are in special education where they're often, in contained classrooms and doing something different. And that's something that I don't think Maine they'd begun to kind of think about it. I don't know where things are now, but it shouldn't be an afterthought. Like thinking about how you do this work in the context of special education is kind of an important and maybe not yet explored deeply enough question. So that's all I would say about that. I had just gotten a time check. I see a few comments here. I agree with everything I'm seeing here. This idea that it's easier to focus on the grades than changing teacher practice, but focusing on the grades takes a lot of time, and then you have no time left over to change teacher practice. So yes, and building a different culture is a lot of work. And so it does, I think it just does raise questions as a legislature, or as legislation being the lever for making these changes, what is the right legislation? If it's not a diploma, what kinds of legislation would be appropriate to move the needle on classroom practice? And should legislation move the needle on classroom practice? I will be agnostic on that, but it is an interesting question. All right, so I'm going to take just another couple minutes to talk about a few of our additional findings. So if you'll go to the next slide, I'm just going to present a little bit about, and this gets at the question someone asked about what variables went into the high, medium, and low. Nothing. Those high, medium, and low are not high, medium, and low. Low, low, medium, and medium really were just the survey results. But then we wanted to say, are there student characteristics that predict membership into a particular profile? So are students who are a particular gender or students who are English learners or students, does that predict where they fall? So that was the first thing that we wanted to know. So if you go to the next slide, we conducted a regression to examine what student characteristics predicted membership into each of these profiles. And there are 3 big takeaways from that. And again, just a reminder that there was no school effect. Like we saw these profiles in all schools, and students from all schools were in each profile. So 3 big takeaways. 1, students from the higher grade levels, so 11th and 12th, reported less exposure to PBE. And that's not surprising because what we knew from our analyses was that in general, the schools were implementing more of this with the lower grades. As they were gearing up for full implementation with that freshman class of 17, 18, they were doing more, and they were sort of letting the 11th and 12th graders phase out of the kind of the old system. So that's not the research bears it out, but that's not kind of a big aha. Here's an interesting one, though. So students with an IEP were more likely to report more exposure to proficiency-based education. And this is likely because some of the items on the survey that are aspects of PBE, if you go back and you look at the different items on the survey, they're also associated with typical IEP practices like being able to retake an assessment, showing multiple modes of learning, experiencing multiple modes of instruction. But again, it is an interesting observation that if students had an IEP, they were more likely to be in those higher profiles. And then finally, some of you may be interested, we were interested as an equity consideration in rural Maine. The primary subgroup that we were looking at was students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. And we did not see that status predicted their membership. So the students' free and reduced price lunch status did not influence or have any predictive power in what profile they were in. So that's it for our prediction, or what predicted membership. So let me go on to the next and final analysis. So remember, we were interested in, were there groups of students? How would we characterize those groups? What predicted membership? And then was there a relationship between membership to a profile, so relationship between the amount of exposure they had to PBE and outcomes in terms of engagement and academic or achievement outcomes. So that was our final question that we asked. If you go to the next slide. We conducted a regression to examine whether there was a statistical association between the profile, the PBE profile, and student self-reported engagement score. So in our survey, we added a set of items about student engagement. And in the paper, you can find out more about those items. So we controlled for typical student characteristics, free and reduced lunch, IEP, et cetera. And we did find that higher exposure to PBE was associated with higher student engagement. So that is, students who are reporting more exposure to practices that include things like personalized instruction and allowing greater flexibility are also feeling more engaged in school. So it's not causal, it's correlational, but it is an interesting finding. And then one more, and that is the last slide of our findings, if you'll switch to it, Melanie. So we conducted a regression to examine whether there was a statistical association between students' profile and their SAT scores. And I want to just have several caveats here. So SAT scores is what we landed on as the proxy for academic outcome, in part because the other outcomes were not available for many of the schools. We had originally thought about a prior academic achievement outcome, and that wasn't available. So because we landed on SAT scores, it's a much smaller sample, because remember, we had 9th to 12th graders, and students tended to take it mostly in 11th, some in 10th, and some in 12th. So that reduced our sample. And there are, it was what we landed on as the measure. So that being said, we did not really land on any conclusive association between PBE and SAT scores. So when you go into the report, you'll see that there was one of the profiles for one grade where there was a slightly negative association. So where being higher PBE, or it was the group that was a mid-level PBE group, had slightly lower SAT scores. It's not a conclusive association. I don't want people, in the press, that some people have sort of tried to make a big deal out of it. It's not really, it doesn't really warrant deep investigation. There's no conclusive evidence of an association between the PBE profile and student achievement, is what I would say, with our SAT scores. I think it does, there are a few things worth noting. It's worth noting that schools were in very early stages of implementation, and that it may be that the slightly negative association we saw was temporary. Often when new reforms come in, there can be a dip in student performance on a traditional assessment, and then it can rise. We don't know if it will. I don't want to predict that it will, but in early implementation, it's tricky to make too much of any finding like that. That's the first thing. And then the other thing I wanted to just say is I think it does raise a question about what are the right measures to employ to look at student achievement or student academic outcomes associated with these reforms. Of course, things like graduation rates and college enrollment or persistence are great measures to say that there is a long-term impact of implementing these kinds of reforms, but those are long-term measures, and you have to wait several years to see those. So how can researchers and evaluators and those interested in this design research that can examine whether exposure to a set of practices positively or negatively impacts student achievement in more traditional ways? So I think I would just say that I think this is something that really needs to be considered, is how to think about what are the appropriate measures when we want to make the case, particularly to policymakers, that implementing these kinds of reforms has positive outcomes. They're going to want the kinds of positive outcomes that are measurable, and thinking about how to link these, how to do research that links to some achievement measures is something that warrants further discussion, further work. So that's it. That's all I have for my findings. I want to go on and say we have a few more minutes for some questions and comments. I'll just put up a few of those on the, Melanie will just go to the last slide. There are a couple questions for you to think about there, but I do see some comments here. So let me pause there, let people think about these questions with the last few minutes we have. And Eric, I don't know if there's anything you want to call our attention to from the chat box.
There's sort of a rich exchange in the chat box between Matthew Shea and our own Rebecca Wolf about sort of the low-hanging fruit. Do you start with changing grading practices? Do you get bogged down in that? How do you get traction at a school site in order to create more opportunities for these proficiency-based models to get implemented at scale? And this is a pernicious question across the field. The one thing that I would add to the conversation that's already there, and I would love for you to comment on it, Karen, would be I think there's no way for us to overestimate the power of teacher beliefs in this process, and the need to provide opportunities for teachers to see these practices being implemented by someone where they can see themselves in it. So sort of see it to believe it approach. So when you have these pockets of robust implementation, that's not necessarily a bad thing as a starting space. If you can find ways to broadcast what's being done in those pockets and let other teachers who are in the doorway, they're peeking through the window, they're thinking about whether they want to try it, to see those things implemented well, those can create opportunities for people to ask the right questions in PLCs, at department level meetings, at school-wide meetings, to start to try those things. And there are multiple inroads to do that. It can be through grading, it could be through student impact, it could be through changes in instruction and changes in curriculum. But I think it's really important to realize that teachers are at an agentic self themselves. They need an agentic approach. They need to see opportunities to mirror or to project themselves into something where they'll be successful, and they need to see it to believe it, and we can provide those things for them so the traction is already ready. Any thoughts about that, Karen?
Yeah. So I would say that I don't think changing teacher practice is low-hanging fruit. I think actually people maybe go to the grading first because it's concrete, and it was 0 to 100, and now it's 1 to 4, and then done, So I actually think that changing practice all of this is a paradigm shift, is what I would say. And And the work that teachers do in the classroom doesn't happen in a vacuum, and bringing people along with them is really critical. I mean, the thing that I think was really hard, what we saw in the field, was just there was so much anxiety about the changes to the way school, as we've always known it, is being done. Just a lot of nerves, a lot of fear, a lot of like, this isn't how I've always experienced it. And so I think all along the way, a lot of work needs to be done to bring people along, to help them understand what we're trying to do. And maybe don't start with changing the things people hold dear, like, and this is just my opinion here, maybe don't start with getting rid of valedictorian and taking away class rank. Maybe that's just too much for most local communities to deal with first. Because remember, there's reform that is taking place where we're starting a brand new school and it's mission driven and this is what we're doing. And then there's trying to retrofit an existing school to a new model. And those require different things, right? They have to approach those as two different kinds of challenges. And I know we're at 2 o'clock. I could go on for hours about this, but I want to respect time, and I hope this is just, if anyone who's on this call wants to continue this conversation, please don't hesitate to be in touch. I'd be happy to keep talking about this.
Indeed. We too at JFF and at the Research Collaborative welcome more conversations and comments. I think to your last point, Karen, this whole landscape of implementation with proficiency-based, competency-based, mastery-based stuff is taking place in a shifting political environment. You know, governors and legislatures are trying to figure out whether to do this or to do that and where to go. And it's research like this that helps to identify where there's traction, where there isn't traction, what to do with these pockets of implementation and innovation, how to think about it. And I think to your last point, Karen, that there are shrewd political moves to make about what you start with and then what you build on next. And I think the genius of the way your research was designed is that it had its implications for us and how we think about those shrewd political moves. And can't thank you enough for helping to build the evidence base and to contribute and move this field just yet another iota forward. So thank you again to the team at EDC. Thank you again to Karen Shakman and her team. We have recorded and we'll be posting this onto the website. I want to recommend that folks go to EDC, go to our Research Collaborative site, download the materials and the summaries. I also recommend downloading, you can see the link in the chat function there, the full EDC survey for competency-based education. It's a rich tool that can really help reveal a lot. It's being used in a lot of great ways. There's some ways that it may be misused, and there's some ways that it's meant to be used. And I believe there's some writing about that we can post also. Anything else you'd want to add, Karen, before we sign off here?
No, I just want to say thank you so much, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Perfect. Thanks so much, everyone. Appreciate it. Stay tuned. More cool stuff coming from the Research Collaborative soon, and we hope you'll stay in touch. Have a great rest of your day, and if we don't connect before then, happy holidays and Happy New Year. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.